on the topic of time. This is not the last lecture. This is not the last lecture of the year, but it's my last lecture because I won't be the co-chair after because of the new election. So before starting the lecture, I would like to thank all the people in the committee. So I'll just do this really quickly. So I want, first thank all the people in the committee. So Elizabeth Krasner, Diana Whitrow, Siyu Guo, Utako Tanabe, Adam Mosa, Sabrina Tyne, Brian Reese, and Dallas Grabs. They were really good. They helped me, and Chris Madison also for all the lectures. And of course, I would like to thank my co-chair, Chris Madison, who did a really good job as well. I would like to thank all the moderators and the speakers that were there during the year, and of course, everyone who came to the lecture. So thank you very much. Also, congratulations to Diana Whitrow, who is the new co-chair of the Junior Fellow Lecture. Okay, so now we can start the lecture. Our moderator tonight is the Junior Journalist Fellow, Mary Agnes Welch. So, Mary Agnes Welch is a public policy reporter at the Winnipeg Free Press, where she has worked for more than a decade. Before Winnipeg, she worked at the Windsor Star and the Odyssey American, a small daily newspaper in West Texas. Mary Agnes is a graduate of Columbia University Journalism School. She has twice been nominated for a National Newspaper Award and has been part of 2 teams of reporter nominated for a Missioner Award. And she's also the former national president of the Canadian Association of Journalists. This year, she is the Sinclair Balfour Journalism Fellow at Massey College. So please welcome Mary Agnes.
Formal up here. So I'm thrilled to be the host. I've really enjoyed these lectures that I've been to this year. The one on the brain, where Shiraz on the urban planning of video games, why credit cards are screwing poor people. They've been totally delightful, so I'm really pleased to hear the lectures tonight. So we're going to start. The theme is time, so we're going to keep ourselves very much on time, even though I think we're technically already late. That's no problem. Angela Schwarzkopf is first, and she's clearly going to play for us as well as talk about her topic. She is Massey's, I would say, resident harpist. She's going to speak about the passage of time in a piece written by the harp composer that she's studying, a French composer. She's a doctoral candidate in music, the first in Canada to pursue a PhD in harp performance, which is quite amazing. She TAs, she judges recitals at the Glenn Gould School of Music. She performs with Sneak Peek Orchestra, Orchestra London, and the Stratford Festival. She's the new president of the Toronto chapter of the American Harp Society. And I asked her a silly question: what is her favorite or least favorite time signature to play in? And she says she actually hates it when the time signature changes from bar to bar in music. That's completely annoying. But she's actually apparently quite good at it. So maybe we'll see some of that tonight. So take it away, Angela, over to you.
Okay, great. I guess I will stand up for the first part and talk to you. So, I'm Angela, and I want you guys to sort of pretend tonight that you are all musicians and performers. So I'm going to speak to you a little bit like you are a performer. So, tonight I will be lecturing on a piece of music by Marcel Tournier called Au Sol du Tempo, and we'll be discussing how the passage of time affects this work. So, within the realm of music, the question of time is a very common one. You will often hear musicians ask, how long did you practice today? When is your gig? What date did the composer write that on? How do you play the rhythm of this passage? And what is the time signature? All these sentences deal with time in a different manner. My partner once said to me, music is the art of time because it happens in time, which I find very poetic. When given the topic of this lecture, I realized I was faced with the challenge of picking what sort of time I would like to follow with the relation to music. Since my dissertation topic deals in part with various concepts of time, I felt it was best to start with an explanation of my doctoral work. So my dissertation is on an extremely important and often forgotten 20th century harpist composer called Marcel Tournier, and he is from France. Tournier began his musical studies on the piano and was considered to have started the harp late, at the age of 16. 2 years after beginning the harp, he started at the Paris Conservatory. Other famous people who studied at the Paris Conservatory are Saint-Saëns and Massey. I'm trying to give you a relationship for some of these things. In 1909, he received the second Grand Prix de Rome and the Prix Rossini. So other famous composers who won this were Berlioz and Bizet, so it's a pretty big prize. Later, he was appointed the successor of his teacher at the Paris Conservatory. Tournier was also friends with some other important guys, Debussy and Ravel, and their compositions and their friendship influenced a lot of his music. By 1931, Tournier was decorated with the Legion of Honor. Marcel Tournier left the harpist with a legacy of over 20 works for solo harp, several chamber works, 6 piano works, and 6 orchestral works, among many other credits to his name. In spite of his incredible influence in the development of the harp in the 20th century, very little literature exists on him. With the goal of filling this gap, I am attempting to write the most complete and comprehensive biography on Tournier. In addition to this, I am investigating the performance practices and oral traditions of his music, the concept of authenticity, and the performer's role within these discourses. Before I can go much further, I need to briefly talk to you about authenticity and performance practice in music. Performance practice can mean a number of things, but generally refers to the custom of playing a piece of music in either a period style, such as the Baroque style, or the way it is commonly performed. I'm sorry, I had to do something silly. The idea of authenticity is a bit more complicated. Authentic, in the case of music, usually means playing it the way the composer intended it, or the way you think they intended it. It can also be interpreted to mean playing in a historical style, on a period instrument, or various other things. Authenticity, performance practice, and composer's intention are all fairly intertwined. So, authenticity, for the purpose of my writing, can be broken down into 3 categories. Being authentic to the composer's intention, being authentic to the printed score, and being authentic to yourself, the performer. Now we can go back to the topic of time, and I would like to today discuss the passage of time in relation to a work by Marcel Tournier, while addressing the issues that arise in attempting to play this work authentically. A Seuil de Temple, or on the Temple's Threshold, is the second piece from the First Image Suite, Opus 29, published in 1925. Tournier's compositions are often categorized as impressionistic, so you can think about Monet and the art movement. These images, or images, are perfect examples of the impressionistic style. They are short, picturesque pieces that are reflective of their titles. So later when you hear a bit of the piece, you can think about a temple and being on the threshold of it. Tournier's wife wrote descriptions to many of his works, including Au Seuil de Temple, and the following is an English translation. At the moment of opening the door of the church, we stay troubled at hearing the hesitant voice of the followers of God. They are already singing psalms of the office, while the soft voice of the bell slowly exclaims to the villagers that it is time to pray. So with all this information in mind, we can now address how the passage of time has affected this piece and the consequences on the performance of it. I would like to start by showing you the current version of this piece that is in print. So we are only going to be looking at about the first 6 bars today for this lecture. Now I want to show you the same piece that I found at the National Library in Paris. Looks the same, right? But it's not. There are quite a few changes. Both of these versions are copyrighted 1925 and bear the same plate number. This was the only time I had seen a different copy of this piece until I came across another one at the Conservatory Library in Rennes on my last research trip. It had a personal inscription in it that indicated the owner had performed it in 1929. When I asked a former student of Marcel Tournier from near the end of his teaching career if she had seen this other version of the piece, she told me she'd never seen it and only learned the version that is currently in print. This indicates to me that the library copies were an early edition of the piece, and Tournier must have made the changes to the work sometime after 1929. It is unclear as to why Tournier made these changes, and it would have been very difficult for him to do so given the printing process at the time, especially if they had the same plate number. So let's take a second to explore some of the reasons why Tournier would have made these changes. So the one on the left here is the one that's currently in print. The one on the right is the one that is no longer in print. So the first change we see is where the first arrow is an added note, and that's a harmonic note on the harp. It sounds like that as opposed to a plug note. So the difference between the opening now, originally he'd written it to be, and now it's going to sound. So my understanding for that would be he would do that maybe to create a more bell-like quality. Harmonics are often associated to sounding like bells. They sound very beautiful. Not that one. So I assume that he added the harmonic to create a more bell-like sound to the opening. The next thing is the change in the tempo, the sedé marking, followed by the T, that's an tempo marking. And the possible reasons for doing this would maybe to create the effect that you are listening to these people singing inside the temple and you're kind of from a distance and their voices are trailing off. So I'm going to play for you first a section without doing the sedé and the tempo, and then I'll play it again with the sedé and you can hear the differences. If I was taking this today, which I should explain, the term means to yield. So I don't know if you guys felt that difference there. The phrase kind of tapered off a bit at the end. So the other change that we should talk about is different notes. He changed notes in the piece. Now the structure of the chord remains the same, but the notes are different. So if I was going to play the second part of the piece, sort of beginning on the third line down, the way that it was originally written, and the way that he changed it, it leaves it sounding a bit more unfinished at what could possibly be a more finished sounding cadence point, although it is not a formal cadence. I also think it might have been to sound a bit more like chant, and plain song and old church modes are something that would be characteristic of the Impressionistic era, so it's not surprising that he would have characterized this in this work. So there are any number of reasons for these changes. What is interesting to consider is how this can affect how you authentically play it. So if we go back to what our three types of authenticity are, first one, being authentic to the composer's attention. Given the information we have, we are given a rare chance to understand how Tournier envisioned the music. Now understanding this poem I shared with you, in addition to understanding a little bit about the Impressionistic movement, it sheds additional light onto why Tournier revised the music the way he did. Unlike other pieces by Tournier where we just see the final copy, with this one we get a bit closer to understanding his thought process and what his musical intentions might be. So if we jump to the second authenticity, being authentic to the store. So if you're handed down an old family copy of this piece and it's in the version that I found in the library, is it wrong to perform it that way? Technically it was the composer's intention at one point, so the problem of different existing versions is not unique to the harp. This issue arises all the time with composers from earlier periods, such as Bach. It is possible to go back to manuscripts of some works and to see the differences between them in published versions. However, it is often unknown which is the final version of a work, how many times there were changes made during the compositional process, etc. In this particular case, given the first version and the piece, given the first version of the piece seems to be widely unknown to the public and by his later students, I feel fairly secure in concluding that the later version would be in line with the composer's intention and thus be the score to attempt to authenticate. The third authenticity is probably the most challenging, being authentic to yourself, the performer. So how, after trying to understand the composer and follow the notations of the music of the score, is there any room left for personal interpretation? Since the first instance of attempting musical notation, your composers have become more and more detailed with their notation. I will once again draw a relation to the Baroque era. In that era, many ornaments would not have been notated in music because it was expected that the performer would just know to do it. As we move from era to era, more and more markings appear on the page. By the time we end up in the 20th century, we have composers like Tournier who are meticulous with their dynamics and tempo markings, leaving little up to the performer, or so it seems. There are two schools of thought on this. One is that every notation on the page is to limit your musical choice as a performer. The other one is that it actually allows the performer more freedom. Although there are more directions, it is up to the performer to decide how much to do any one of those markings. So again, like with this today that I was showing you, to yield, sit down, I could choose to do a very small amount, or I could choose to do quite a lot. It's really up to the performer. I'm a firm believer that to be authentic to yourself as a musician, you first have to do your research, understand what the piece is about, where it came from, read up on the composer. If they are live or if they have a living student, try and have a lesson with them. Once you have all the information, only you, the performer, can then make musical choices in how you intend to perform a piece. The concept of authenticity is a never-ending debate, and the passage of time does little for assisting this discussion besides adding questions. What is important is to ask those questions and try to answer them. Because the more time that passes, the harder it is to reach the tempo.
You gonna play? Laura gonna play.
Oh,
yeah?
Is there time?
I think so. Yeah.
Yes?
Yes?
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, I will play the whole piece. It's just a minute or a minute and a half maybe.
And the other two speakers can play too.
And then if they would like to play, they can play too. Okay.
Art lover, former international athlete, and current MBA student. He did his undergrad and his MA at the University of Bath, focusing on politics, economics, and then international security. He worked in London as a country risk and financial markets analyst, covering Eastern Europe. I only vaguely know what that means. He's going to talk about the interplay between financial markets, technology, volatility, and the implications for policymaking and investing. And I asked him if he could travel back in time and invest in any company he wanted to. He would go back to 1931, the Great Depression, and invest in GE. So maybe we'll find out why that is. Okay, take it away, Taylor.
Okay, welcome. So, I'm going to touch, hopefully fit all of that into 10 minutes or less. I don't have any notes, so if I pay undue attention to the screen, it's because I need to look at the screen. So, in terms of compressed timescales of financial markets, one of the coolest things that have been happening over the last 7 years, or the last almost 7 years, has been the idea of compressing timescales. And one timescale that's been compressing is the decision-making timescale in financial markets. Decisions need to be made faster and faster and faster. And the other timescale that's been compressed has been investors' time horizons. How far in the future can you realistically look? So when you have decisions that need to be made more quickly and your horizon doesn't extend as far, this creates a lot of questions and a lot of uncertainty. So where to start? So for me, my presentation starts sort of talking about what's happened since 2008, 2007. And this is because it's at the top of everyone's mind and everyone's lived through it. Of course, financial market turbulence is nothing new. I started with 1929 because that's when most of the modern financial market architecture has been in place since. You had the Fed, you had Dow Jones. But if you go back through time, financial panics are pockmarked throughout history. So 1929, 1970s, Black Friday in the 80s, 1998, when you had a tremendous amount of turbulence around the world, 2001 dot-com bubble. So what's different now? Well, since 2008, what we've seen has been more policy uncertainty than is usual. In the US, more acrimonious politics related to the division between Democrats and Republicans. More questions surrounding what is the long-term sustainable rate for policy in terms of taxation rates, in terms of social programs. And then you turn to Europe. Europe has been a great project since World War II, and you've had a lot of stability, but now that project is being called into question. And you also have the rise of China. What is the world going to look like in 15 years? Can you extrapolate out China's growth, and China becomes the biggest economy by 2025, 2030? And on the monetary policy side, what we've seen since 2008 is a huge amount of innovation in monetary policy that essentially is historically unproven and is one giant monetary policy experiment. I'm not trying to scare you. It's just sort of what's been going on. So you have central banks having an almost unprecedented impact on financial markets. And what does that mean? Well, it builds a lot of what we would call moral hazard into the system. The idea that if something goes wrong, the central bank will step in as the lender of last resort. You also have interest rates at 0% at the zero bound. They can't go any lower than that. And that creates a lot of weird things in the financial market in terms of liquidity, in terms of where money flows and how it flows. And then you have, when you look at country level, you have competitive currency devaluations as people try and get an edge in the world, and that starts at the country level. So what is different now? I looked at the policy side and the economic side. Well, what's different from a financial market perspective? What's really changed in terms of the dynamics? So one thing that's been a huge change has been electronic trading and just the speed at which trading can take place. And this is a function of the internet and a function of high-speed internet connections. The idea that people can trade using computer algorithms. You don't need people to trade stocks and bonds and currencies anymore. They can trade, for example, one fund, for example, has a trading strategy based on Twitter feeds. So no people involved, they look at Twitter trends and trade based on that. And this builds into the high-frequency trading phenomenon. So high-frequency trading is essentially super fast trading. There's really no other way to put it. High volume, large amounts of money being moved around. However, what this really manifests in is just a lot of churn and a lot of noise and no real underlying sense of where the market is going. And then you have the size of the global derivatives market. I haven't put the numbers on that scale, but on the bottom left, you have the global equity market, which is worth about $55 trillion in 2012. Global GDP, just a little bit ahead at $83 trillion. The global bond market, government debt, private debt, everything, about $157 trillion. And then something called derivatives. And derivatives are essentially just pieces of paper, and their value is derived from the value of the assets. So let's say you have a derivative on corn. I will enter into a contract with you to bet on the price of corn. So one thing that I can do is we don't actually physically trade any corn when the contract comes due. It's literally just a contract exchanging what you think the price is going to do in the future. And all of this builds into the fact that global derivatives markets, well, we talk about global bonds and equity markets all the time. We talk about the Dow Jones in the morning, get it on the news. Global derivatives markets are $1.4 quadrillion in nominal value. And this money is, it doesn't move around every day. Very little cash actually change hands, but the underlying nominal amount is $1.4 quadrillion. So one thing that I think can really visualize it for us, and I'm about to throw up on the screen, is a GIF actually that was created by people who track what go on in the market and track the sort of churn that's been happening since 2007. And it's a really good graphical representation. And it's going to be, so that's the market open from 9:30 till 4. And what you see across the bottom is across all the stock markets in the US, all the exchanges, the amount of bid churn, which is just orders being placed on the market. And it starts in January of 2007. And if you want to follow it, we're going to go through all the way until the middle of 2012. And if you can point out any, I'm going to ask you at the end, if you can point out any themes or patterns you see. So as we move through 2008, you start to get a little bit more high-frequency trading. You also have more volatility in the market. This is coming into the global financial crisis. You can see the amount of churn on the market starts to build. And it runs for about a minute. So
So what are the different colors?
the different colors represent the different exchanges.
Interesting.
What year is this?
We're just coming into November 2010, and we're through the turn of the year into 2011.
We're going down the colors.
So right now we start to see a little bit more of Europe. This is every day. So, and that's cycling back to the beginning. So, as you can see, what's happened in the last 5 years. So, two particularly interesting yet also sort of parasitic high-frequency trading techniques, one of which is called quote stuffing. And that was a graphical representation of what we would call quote stuffing. And quote stuffing is essentially tricking the market into thinking there's demand behind orders. And what you do is you will submit a large amount of orders and then quickly cancel them. And the idea is you try and trick other investors who are less informed into thinking there's a large amount of demand behind an order and immediately canceling it and hopefully to capitalize on the change in the price. So that's what the graphical representation was. So what's the combination of all these factors? Lots more market ructions. There's May 2010 flash crash, where the market lost 9.7% of its value in the middle of the day and then quickly recovered. At the top chart on the right there is actually the stock price of Accenture. You see it goes from around $40, and then all of a sudden people decide they don't need consultants anymore, ever. And it goes to 1 cent and quickly recovers. That would be a high frequency trading glitch in the system. The great argument for high frequency trading is the idea that, you know, they got it all back, they didn't actually make a mistake. Well, that's not all that comforting. August 2012, Knight Capital. Knight Capital essentially spent a Tuesday night for 4 hours back testing a new trading algorithm and launched it the next morning. And it had a problem and quickly lost $440 million in the space of a morning and almost brought down the entire company. So this is going on and it's being widely implemented. The other factor of this is you start to think more about the European financial and sovereign debt crisis. Well, there are clear fundamental economic problems there. The idea of increasingly interconnected global capital flows means that the news cycle can become quite negative and become negatively reinforcing. And there are spillover effects to other markets. If you look at the core markets, you see that a lot of these markets are increasingly being tied together by high-frequency trading and automatic trading strategies that capitalize on the correlation between different asset classes. And that means there's an increasing risk that a very large spike or collapse in one market can spill and snowball into other ones without due regard for the fundamentals behind such a move. So overall, volatility is rising. On the left here, we have essentially what is a distribution of trading days, movement in trading days. In the 1960s, in terms of percentage movements, the number of days that have certain percentage movements. And as we can see, as we move from the 1960s to the 2000s, the tails start getting a little bit fatter. And we can see that volatility has increased through time. So what does this mean for investing? Well, in terms of the investor level, when you have the policy side, which is increasingly, you have the question of what's the world going to look like in 10 years, long-term time horizons start to get shorter and shorter. Instead of thinking 30 years down the line, you're thinking 10. If you're not sure what's going to happen to Greece in 6 months, you're thinking 6 months down the line in terms of Europe. And what's this mean for participant behavior? It means that people don't buy and hold. It means that a lot of stability in the market gets taken out. And it also means for people in the market prefer to take the short-term payout. So the idea that investment bankers should get paid bonuses yearly instead of, or CEOs get paid out based on yearly performance rather than incentive pay based on how the stock price or how the company is doing in 5 years, sort of goes out the window. And the other big problem that we have is the risk premium for investing is rising. If you look at Europe and you look at Italy, Italy should not be a problem in Europe. Italy runs a primary budget surplus, excluding its large debt load. It should not be a problem. And if you look at the market level, what we've really seen is a big loss of faith in the public, by the public in financial markets. They think it's a game. They think it's a casino. And this is a huge problem, not only for people who invest and people who are active in markets, but also for the public at large. The financial markets play an incredibly important role allocating capital. And if people don't trust that system, then this has much larger implications. And on top of that, in terms of trust in the system, what you have is the rise of shadow institutions and the rise of shadow banking. So one of the legacies of the 2008 financial crisis is the hampering of official financial institutions such as banks. And when they are unwilling to lend, hedge funds step in, private equity funds step in, large-scale asset managers step in to provide those funds that banks don't. However, these funds are not as clearly regulated as banks would be. And you also have shadow markets. And what shadow markets means is trading is, as you can see from the high-frequency impact of quote stuffing, most trading is moving off official exchanges and is moving into things such as dark pools, where large blocks of trades get exchanged with other people and you don't know the other side of the trade. And this presents problems as well in terms of, do people know what the prices of things are? And the implications for policy, frankly, there needs to be a regulation and regime shift. First step in this, Dodd-Frank,
which regulates capital rules for banks as well as trading rules. Basel III, capital rules for banks, what banks can and cannot do. High frequency trading, do we need to have rules regarding high frequency trading? The SEC remains happily in denial about some of the more sinister things that high frequency traders do under the guise that they provide a service to the market in terms of price discovery. That's not so clear. Derivatives, it's a huge market and it's a huge risk. In terms of derivatives, mortgage-backed securities are derivatives for existence. For instance, in Europe, implications for policy, we've seen a negative feedback loop, and you know, everyone's consensus is austerity, austerity, austerity. We need to satisfy the market. Well, the cure could kill the patient. So in terms of what we have going forward, and then of course in the US, denial about its problems. So is there cause for optimism? Well, I would argue yes. In a world where no one can hide on the policy front, in a world where financial markets are hyper-aware, there is nowhere to hide. Maybe this leads to improved policymaking. In the last 5 years, paradoxically, we've seen great strides in some emerging markets and frontier markets in terms of policymaking because they are very afraid of what the bond market will do if they make a policy misstep. So an example of this would be Serbia. Not to pick on Serbia, but Serbia is a European Union candidate country now. And if you think about 8 years ago, 10 years ago, this would largely be beyond the realm of imagination. And more so the opportunities for sound investments. You have greater interconnectedness. If a country is a sound country, capital is increasingly able to get there. And another thing, for the most part, people recognize that there are big problems out there. There is a problem with banks getting bailed out and bankers getting bonuses the next year. There is a problem with high-frequency trading. How we're going to deal with that problem and how we isolate certain sinister aspects of high-frequency trading and keep some of the more beneficial parts, that's a question that still needs to be answered. So, thank you.
Thanks, Taylor. I totally understood that, and kind of wish I didn't, actually. Next, we've got Clara. Clara Steinhagen. Yes. Nerf gun enthusiast, clock dancer, and first-year MA PhD student at the Institute for the History of Philosophy of Science and Technology. She did her BA at Iona College in New Rochelle, New York. She's particularly interested in the role of science and medicine in early modern Europe, but she's begun to serve as a research assistant at the Scientific Instruments Collection, which I didn't even know we had at the U of T, where she's recently developed a fascination with material culture. And not to simplify too much, but she's basically going to talk to us about the first watch. And so I asked her what her very first watch was, and she said it was purple and sparkly and very shiny, and she was 8. Take it away.
So this is a project that's still currently underway, so I welcome any suggestions or feedback. The whole thing starts with this object. It's in the Fisher archive. If you want to see it, you can request to. It's in a small cardboard box that was donated to the U of T by R.K. Young, who was the first director of the Dunlap Observatory. It's very small, as you can see. It's made of brass, very highly decorated. And on the back, there's a list of cities with their corresponding latitudes, mostly cities in France, all of them in Western Europe. So this, and there's also a small compass embedded in it, as you can see. So this piece was made around 1700 by Michael Butterfield, who was an instruments manufacturer who was originally from England, but who had a successful workshop in Paris. There are lots of examples of pieces like this, almost identical in fact, in existence still. Most of them built similarly, although some of them have different motifs or different cities on the back, depending on where the person was planning to travel. But one of the first questions that immediately arises with this piece is how on earth does it work? Because we've all seen sundials in gardens or on statues, but these ones work because they're stationary. The sun moves around the gnomon, which is the shadow casting pointer, and the shadow corresponds to the marked lines that are determined with complicated geometry that I'm still trying to figure out. But it only works if the dial is carefully oriented so that the gnomon points north, and it's also set at an angle that's equal to the latitude of the place where it is located. I'll explain why shortly. This sort of thing is supposed to be a joke. Sundials don't work though. That's Fred Flintstone. But in fact, portable sundials are actually some of the oldest forms of timekeepers. The simplest form of the instrument would be just a stick of a determined length that you would stick in the ground. And as the sun rose to a higher altitude in the morning, the shadow of the stick would shorten, and in the afternoon it would lengthen. The earliest definite sundial that we know of was discovered in the tomb of Tutmosis III. It dates from about 1500 BCE. As you can see, it doesn't really look like the decorative sundials that we are familiar with. That's because, like the stick in the ground, it's an altitudinal sundial rather than a directional one. And this circumvents the problem of orienting the dial, because all you have to do is turn, excuse my terrible Microsoft Paint job, you turn the dial so that this vertical point is facing the sun. And this will cast a shadow on the horizontal piece, and where the shadow hits these markings will determine what time of day it is. This design isn't without its problems, because seasonal changes most obviously would throw this off considerably, but it's still useful. Among ancient Greek artifacts, we find other styles of portable sundials. These ones are shaped like little pillars. They're designed with a small piece at the top so they can be dangled, so they're perfectly vertical. This is a Renaissance painting of a Renaissance piece. I couldn't find a good picture of any ancient Greek ones, but it's the same basic principle. The gnomon on these dials would be fixed horizontally at the top, casting shadow on the pillar. Another terrible Microsoft Paint job. And inscribed on this dial would be a curved grid which marked the different hours for the different times of the year. So I've only done like 3 lines, but there should be 12. And to tell the time, one would note the month and then find what line the shadow hit in the space marking that month. And dials like these were used well into the medieval period in Europe. In terms of the way that time is considered, these ones are particularly interesting because they divide the time between sunrise and sunset into 12 equal periods. So an hour will be a different length depending on what season it is, presumably only because they were only interested in the time that they could use working outside. There was no electric lighting or whatever. The system that we use today, where the divided into 24 equal hours, was used by astronomers, but it didn't become part of everyday timekeeping until the end of the 13th century, which is when clocks became a prominent feature in like town squares. And clockwork mechanisms obviously can't mark unequal hours, and so equal hour timekeeping necessarily became a feature of medieval life. Another cool example of a portable medieval sundial is the chalice sundial. The shadow would lengthen, or the gnomon was set vertically in the center of the bowl of the chalice, and the shadow would lengthen or shorten depending on the hour. The insides of the cup are marked with a grid, kind of like the cylinder. Horizontal lines mark the hours, and vertical ones indicated the zodiac, which they use instead of the months. So you would line up the shadow with whatever zodiac symbol corresponded to the time it was, the time of year. And then the shadow of the tip of the gnomon would indicate the time of day. Some of these were actually designed to be read through water or white wine, which I think we should get from Massey. That would be really cool. But they were probably more ceremonial pieces than actual precision instruments. So all of this is really interesting history, but the thing is, all of these dials rely on the height of the sun rather than its direction. So it's not, you don't really have to worry about the orientation issue to get a reasonable level of time-telling accuracy. But the dial that we're looking at is a directional dial, and its ability to tell time relies on the direction from which the sun hits it, not how high the sun is. And for it to work, the gnomon must always be pointed north. And not only that, the angle of the gnomon has to be parallel to the Earth's axis, or else the shadow will vary with the seasons. As you know, the Earth is tilts at an angle of 23.5 degrees to its plane of orbit, and any indicator parallel to the axis will cast a shadow at the same point every day of the year, but if not, then it will behave a little differently every day of the year. With a stationary dial, this calculation is fairly easy to do because you use the stars to determine true north and you orient your gnomon to point that way. And then you position the dial so that the plate is horizontal to where you're standing. And then, that's as if it was a huge sundial, but imagine it smaller. And then you set the gnomon at an angle equal to your latitude, which would set it parallel to the Earth's axis. And then you have an accurate time-telling device. With mobile dials, however, the process is more complicated because A, you're using it in the daytime, that's the only time you can use the sundial, and you won't have the stars to tell you where true north is. And B, if you travel to a latitude other than the one where the sundial was manufactured for, then the shadow will be different and your dial will be inaccurate. The problem of determining true north was solved by the addition of a magnetic compass, an instrument which was developed in China in the 11th century, which became widely used in Europe by the 13th century. There are many extant examples of portable dials from the 14th century on that contain compasses, including rings like this from that's 1570 in Switzerland. These were probably more ceremonial. The gnomon was a string. It's been lost, but there was a string that was threaded between that hole and the one at the base of the ring, so you could fold it over. And there was a tiny compass in the center. The U of T, or no, the U of T doesn't come on this. The two pieces are set on a hinge and the string is stretched between them to cast a shadow. But these are also pretty inaccurate because the rule for sundials is generally the smaller they are, the less accurate they are. The issue, so that's the issue of true north. The second issue is different latitudes. Some manufacturers, like Leonhard Andreas Karner, who made this one, they made it so that the gnomon was a string that was adjustable. So you would thread the string through a hole that was marked with your latitude. And this is the one U of T has. I just took a picture of that today. And as you can see, these little indicators, you would thread it through whatever latitude you're at and it would be accurate. And some other dials got around the problem by simply providing multiple scales for multiple latitudes. But you can only fit so many of those on a single dial, maybe fit 2 or 3 max. So here's where we get to the Butterfield dial. So you can use the compass to determine with true north with reasonable accuracy to orient the dial, and then you need to find your latitude. You can perhaps consult a helpful list on the back, presuming you don't venture far from France. Then you do one of two things. If your latitude is either 49, 45, or 40, you can just take note of where the shadow falls on the scale marked with your latitude. So there's like different clock faces almost. So this one does have multiple scales. If your latitude isn't one of those, however, you have to adjust the gnomon. And if you look at this little gnomon, this bird's beak points to this little scale, and you can raise or lower it. And so what you do is you just adjust that thing so the bird's beak is pointing to your latitude, and then it's set at the right angle. So these dials were very popular in their day because, as I mentioned before, there's a lot of these in existence. And they're also pretty simple to use. They're very compact. They're small. That's me holding it. It's very tiny. However, in terms of telling precise time, it wasn't the most accurate instrument for a lot of reasons. First of all, wandering magnetic poles. This was a phenomenon that they recognized even in the early modern period. The compass was not always precisely accurate. It would always point to either one side or another of true north by a couple of degrees. And you can account for this if you knew the variation by putting a degree scale on the compass, but that still complicated things and made it harder to use. Another issue was the small size of the instrument. My hand's that big. And the fact that shadows cast on metal like this won't have a sharp, accurate edge on the scale. And all in all, you could probably estimate maybe to 10 or 15 minutes, which isn't that bad for 1700, but not great if you want exact precision. And there are other more complicated styles of sundial, portable ones, that were much more accurate, but they required a lot more careful adjustments and a lot more scientific know-how. So the popularity of these Butterfield dials, despite their relative inaccuracy, suggests that they were part of the vogue of science in Enlightenment Europe, because pocket watches hadn't become widely used for good reason. They were, at this point, they were pretty crude. They were driven by coiled springs. They'd been in existence since the 16th century, but they needed to be frequently wound, and due to uneven springs or friction between the parts, they were not reliable constant timekeepers. By the early 19th century, however, watches had been improved to the point where the average layperson had access to them. They were more reliable and more widely available. Portable sundials continued to be used to check watches into the middle of the century, but they were no longer used for day-to-day timekeeping. So I guess the final question is, why is this particular dial interesting and significant to study? And I think that it's really indicative of the Enlightenment society where science and travel were so fashionable. This one, like I said, wasn't the most accurate or precise, but it was beautiful, convenient, and mass-produced. Kind of like today's fancy watches, it was probably a status symbol. Carrying around a timepiece indicates that one's time is valuable and structured, and it's a kind of neat way to think about the way in which scientific instruments, which are supposed to be purely functional, are used to reinforce fashions and social structures.
Okay, so questions. I have some, but I'll open it up to the floor. Usually there's like a million questions.
Maybe a nice way of opening up the discussion would be what the role of time has been in your own research, in your own careers as scholars.
Well, I'm a historian, so time is like a big, it's a major concern because you're always worried about, especially working with these instruments, because it's like what time does to an object. And it's always very exciting when we find an instrument that still works or is still in excellent condition. So I guess time makes studying scientific material culture a lot more tangible. That makes sense.
I have a great timeliness to the project that I'm doing. I'm dealing with someone who's no longer alive, but he has living students that are left. And I'm dealing with time running out in the sense that they're quite old, and if someone doesn't do the work of speaking with them now, a lot of oral traditions that are associated with the music that I'm dealing with will be lost forever, or they'll just be continuing to be passed on, and each year or each generation that an oral tradition is passed on, it loses some of its value, or the information gets changed. So there's quite a timeliness to my project.
Probably not particular to me. I often wish there were more hours in the day. But in terms of time for me, in terms of just compressed time scales and financial markets. But I guess they'll go back to one thing my dad told me as I was growing up, always have a greater sense of urgency in terms of going out and making sure you get ahead of what other people are doing. And in terms of financial markets, that's becoming increasingly difficult.
Who's next?
I have one for Taylor, but I can't quite resist telling a quick anecdote about your stuff before. So I heard about essentially using algorithmic trading essentially on a millisecond scale for the first time, I think in 2006. And I asked the guy, if I look at this as an engineer, I see like a dynamic system that has a very fast reaction time, like a feedback time, and that usually means that these systems go unstable very fast and they can like oscillate and go crazy out of bounds. And if he has any idea how to make sure that this doesn't happen. And he answered somewhat inconsistently, well, I guess that's the reason why most traders have an average age of 23. I'm not quite sure how that belongs together, but I thought it was a little bit scary. And apparently, yeah, there is no real reason to stabilize it. Actually, my question almost goes into the other direction. So one thing I noticed in all these financial troubles over the last few years was that there was often this cycle, almost brings it back to the Sundial actually, of like some kind of like financial news springing around the world. So something changed on the New York market, then everybody was kind of anxious about the Asian markets opening and how they would react, and that essentially influenced again how nervous the European markets were. So it was actually a little bit of an opposite mechanism where these time delays in these very old-fashioned ways of actually opening the stock exchange in the morning and just closing it in the afternoon actually almost seemed to compound the nervousness of this. Is this something that could actually be helped a little bit by having essentially 24-hour trading?
So one of the conspicuous markets that does have 24-hour trading is the currency market. Trades 5 days a week, 24 hours a day. In terms of how close we are to 24-hour trading, when the S&P 500 closes in New York, you can start trading S&P futures, and they start trading them in Tokyo. So in terms of the 24-hour news cycle, there are a lot of people who can say 5 minutes before the market opens in New York, you know, based on where these futures contracts are, New York should open 20 points lower. So in terms of people making the connection between different markets and different opens, I think a lot of that information has been gleaned. In terms of going to 24-hour trading on equity markets and bond markets, a lot of people would like to go home at 5 p.m. So I think there might not be as much movement towards that.
I think someone once observed that the difference between Western scholars and maybe Aboriginal communities is that Western society tends to focus on history and tends to keep its eyes looking backwards, whereas in Aboriginal communities, apparently, people keep their eyes sort of trained on the future, thinking about sort of sustainability and models for how things can be sort of kept the same or enhanced in the future. Turning that into a question, I guess, if you were to sort of apply some of the learning that you've gained over the years looking at historical patterns and things like that, what would you predict for the future, one major development in your field?
That's a heavy question. Okay. Angela, you haven't been picked on yet.
That's fine. A major development in my field based on things we've learned from the past, in a simplified form is your question, right? Okay, so I guess a major development that sort of relates to my research is that I think greater care is being taken today to notate or to speak with composers and to learn what people wanted in their music and just document people's lives while they're living than was in the past. So a lot of research has been done on Bach, and he's really well known, but you know, there's things that we will never know about him, and I think people regret that we don't have the ability to know those things about him because he's so important to the development of music. So I think greater care is being taken today to preserve these traditions with musicians or composers that are already alive or still alive.
In terms of looking forward, I think that in any field things go in cycles. So one of the things in finance, I think the cycle for the next 15 to 20 years is you're going to have the rise of investors with extremely long time horizons who are willing to go into a market that has a lot of churn in it or has a lot of maybe false information or where it's hard to sift between where real demand for an asset is and what is actually just noise. So, and that's going to play into people's perceptions and how people get paid, especially in finance. So the idea of brokers or bankers getting paid $10 million in the early 2000s, I don't think that's ever coming back. I think that it's going to move more towards true value added, and I think some of the short-termism in financial markets right now, where you have intense lobbying by the banking industry, is their recognition that the party is sort of already over in terms of the easy money leading up to 2008, and that going forward the financial market is not going to be the gravy train or the perceived gravy train that it was for the last 10 or 15 years.
Clara.
Well, in terms of scientific material culture specifically, what I've noticed that's kind of interesting working for the Scientific Instruments Collection is that there's a lot more awareness of the value of recent, preserving recent scientific artifacts that we would generally consider just to be obsolete technology. Going into professors' offices who retired and who have just kept all this old equipment from the 70s or 80s or even 90s that they haven't used anymore and they thought it was just junk. And we're preserving it in the archive alongside this sort of thing. So I think that, I guess it's a better awareness of what we need to preserve and how quickly we need to preserve it, and not just cast stuff off as obsolete. Directly from use to archive.
Good answer. Next question. I secretly want to ask Taylor about my RSP, so don't let me do that.
I have a question for Clara. I was reading somewhere, folks put a lot of value into typewriters now, and very few people, it's something that's passed down, at least in some families, the typewriter is passed down through the decades. And I was wondering, do you think pieces like, iPads or our laptops, is that something that you see passed down from father to son to daughter to granddaughter?
In terms of like technology now?
Yeah.
No.
No. Why do you think that is?
Oh, I mean, think about the last time you got a new laptop. What did you do with did you save your old one? I mean, you might have given it to your little sibling. I gave my old laptop to my little sister because she didn't have one. But, I mean, once something is obsolete and you're done, and you have access to like a cheaper one or a better one, or you kind of, I mean, it's not something you generally want to preserve, I guess. In terms of these things, maybe it might have been different because I think there's less obsolescence to deal with when there's a sundial involved. I mean, you'll have a pocket watch, but the sundial will still work. It won't like wear out. It won't get slow. So.
80s home computers are becoming collector's items. I still have my Commodore.
Maybe.
So I think maybe laptops are not unique enough. Like what's new.
Next question. We have time for a couple more. Oh, I see.
My question's for Taylor. In the reading that I've done for a lot of my classes, they've talked about the recent rise of financialization, and as somebody who knows nothing about how money works and money systems, is that kind of what you are talking about in your presentation, or is there something more to financialization?
If I was thinking about financialization, I would be inclined to speak about the proliferation of financial instruments that are essentially allow people to hedge or make directional bets on, so bets on movements of prices on any range of things, whether it's the price of tea in China or a collection of mortgages in the United States. They found ways to collect baskets of risk and baskets of return and slice them up into almost an infinite amount of, in almost an infinite number of ways. And on one hand, you're providing a service because by doing so, you're matching an investor with someone who usually needs money. And on one hand, that's a great service. But on the other hand, there's this idea, speaking about derivatives, which is probably the major beneficiary of financialization, and how big that market is. Most of it is unregulated. It's what would be called the over-the-counter market, which essentially is between two parties. It doesn't go through an exchange. Often collateral requirements, which is the requirement to post some asset against the possibility of a loss in the contract, is not stipulated. So in terms of financialization, to your point, there has been a move towards more regulation of over-the-counter derivatives, and an idea, and there is a recognition that this is a major development, and it hasn't been fully conceptualized in terms of its impact.
Time for one more.
about the time dials again, about the sundials again. Very fascinating, by the way. I was thinking if I actually wanted essentially a wristwatch sundial, I would have to build essentially a water level compass needle and put the sundial on top of that. Have you seen anything like that?
Yeah, well, not in the water, but the dry sundial. There's actually, in the same box that this thing came in,
Yeah.
R.K. Young apparently was a collector of pocket sundials, and there's a little sundial. It's like it's about that big. It's wood. It's got like a wooden cap, and there's a compass on it. There's a compass that will move a point north, and that has a sundial set onto it. In terms of the mechanics of that, I think it's obviously easier to work. I don't know whether it's more accurate or not.
I can't.
Like I said, this is a work in progress.
I can't speak to the mechanics, but Lee Valley makes a sundial that has its own lanyard. It's very beautiful.
And then you have to put it somewhere.
I think you twist it for the month. I haven't gotten one yet, but.
Please show me as soon as.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we're done. We're done? Yeah. Thank you, Dorothy.
Please thanks Mary for being the moderator.